She was a mother, an empress, and a ruler in her own right. But her story ends not with a crown, but with poison. Not from an enemy, not from a rival, but from her own son-in-law. Irene of Athens once held the throne of Byzantium. She outlived her husband. She dethroned her own son. She ruled alone in a world where women were never meant to reign. And for that, she was erased, exiled, silenced, until one day the cup was lifted and her breath never came back. This is not a tale of glory. This is the slow decay of a woman devoured by power, betrayed by blood, and buried by history. This is the forgotten fall of Irene of Athens. She was not born into a palace, not surrounded by silk or sword, but by books, whispers, and the quiet dignity of ancient stones. Irene came from Athens, a city that once birthed philosophers and emperors, but by the 8th century had faded into the margins of an empire ruled from Constantinople. Her family belonged to the provincial nobility, Greek by heart, Byzantine by law. She was not a princess, but her lineage was respectable enough to be noticed by the court, and that was all that mattered. We do not know her thoughts, her dreams, or her voice. Her letters are gone. Her childhood has been swallowed by the silence of time. But we know this: she was chosen. At 16, she was summoned from the shadows of Athenian ruins into the golden glare of imperial politics. The Empress of Byzantium, Eudokia, had died suddenly. Perhaps poisoned, perhaps not. The throne beside Emperor Leo IV stood empty. The empire needed a bride for its young ruler. Irene was selected not for love, nor even for ambition, but for her appearance. Chroniclers describe her as beautiful. That was enough. But the journey from Athens to Constantinople was not a wedding procession. It was a departure from the life she knew, and an entry into a world ruled by spies, saints, eunuchs, and steel. The palace was not a home. It was a mirror, polished and cold, reflecting everything back except the soul. When she arrived at court, Irene was examined, weighed, and paraded like a vessel. She passed. The marriage was arranged. She became Augusta, Empress of the Romans, at 17. But what did it mean to wear the crown in Byzantium? It meant invisibility. As consort to Leo IV, Irene was expected to bear sons, keep silent, and disappear behind veils and protocol. The empire was at war with itself. Iconoclasm raged. Images of saints were being destroyed, monasteries closed, monks whipped in public squares. Irene, secretly an iconophile, one who believed in holy images, was expected to suppress her faith. So she smiled. She knelt, and she waited. Her son, Constantine, was born in 771, a healthy boy, a living heir. The empire exhaled, but the child came into a world fractured by theology and ambition. Irene knew that to survive in such a place, she could not remain a shadow. She would have to step into the light. But the light in Byzantium burned. Her husband, Leo IV, was ill. Tuberculosis, perhaps. He grew thinner each year, coughing blood in the corridors of the palace. And as his health declined, so did his trust in Irene. He accused her of treason. He stripped her of wealth, confined her to private chambers, and humiliated her allies. But he did not kill her. In 780, Leo died unexpectedly. The crown passed not to a general, not to a bishop, not to a rival prince. but to their 9-year-old son. And so began the quiet rise of Irene, not as queen, not as wife, but as mother to the emperor. For the first time, she breathed freely, not deeply, not safely, but freely. Yet even in those early days of regency, the court watched her with suspicion. A Greek woman from Athens, a supporter of icons, a woman with no imperial blood. What right did she have to shape policy, to speak on behalf of the child emperor? But Irene did not flinch. She replaced generals. She appointed iconophile bishops. She rebuilt monasteries. She held audiences, issued edicts, sat on the throne during ceremonies. Her presence, once ornamental, became administrative. She wore the regalia. She spoke with imperial authority. Some called her mother of the empire. Others called her witch. But no one could ignore her. She had crossed the threshold. No longer just the girl from Athens, no longer a pawn, but something far more dangerous. A woman who had tasted power and survived the first sip. And so, the palace shifted. Murmurs thickened, and in the shadows of basilicas and bathhouses, voices whispered, "What will she do when the boy comes of age?" The answer was still far away, but even then, in that early hour of her regency, the path was already tilting. Toward betrayal, toward exile, toward a poison that would one day be poured not by an assassin, but by someone who once bowed at her table. The girl from Athens had entered the lion's den, and the lion, for now, slept. But no one had told her that lions dream, and when they wake, they remember. Power, when wrapped in velvet and handed to a woman, is rarely a gift. It is a test, a trap, a throne built from expectations and swords hidden beneath the cushion. When Leo IV died in 780, Irene was left not only a widow, but the guardian of a crown. Her son, Constantine VI, was just 9 years old, too young to rule, too fragile to defend. Yet his bloodline was sacred, and in that small body pulsed the future of an empire still bleeding from theological war. Irene did what no woman was meant to do in Byzantium. She took the regency. Not quietly, not humbly, but with eyes wide open and spine straight as a cathedral pillar, her signature began to appear beside the emperor's on imperial decrees. Her voice echoed in the palace halls. Her face, unveiled, determined, became a presence not behind, but beside the throne. For the first time in living memory, the empire was ruled in the name of a boy, by a woman. And that was an abomination to many. Byzantium was a maze of men, generals, patriarchs, court officials, eunuchs, and bureaucrats, all trained to see women as vessels, not vessels of thought or power, but of heirs, of modesty, of silence. Irene's rise threatened their order. Her policies threatened their theology. She was an iconophile, and under her regency, the images returned. Holy icons, banished and burned under her husband's rule, were welcomed back into churches. Monks who had been whipped now chanted again beneath domes. The faces of saints, once scraped from the walls, were repainted with tears and gold. For some, it was a renaissance. For others, a heresy reborn. But Irene did not flinch. She called the Second Council of Nicaea in 787, a gathering of bishops and emperors to restore the veneration of icons as legitimate worship. It was a political triumph, a spiritual turning point. And yet, it was not hers to own. It was done in the name of her son. Constantine VI remained the symbol, the figurehead, the young lion asleep beneath her wing. And as he grew, so did the danger. A boy may sit quietly on a throne at 9, but at 15, at 16, he begins to wonder why his mother still holds the scepter. He begins to ask questions, dangerous ones. The court watched the boy grow, watched his shoulders broaden, his eyes sharpen, watched his fingers twitch, not like a child's, but like a prince ready to grasp what he believed was rightfully his. Irene knew what was coming. She had ruled for 6 years in his name, and the longer she held on, the more fragile her grip became. Because Constantine was not just her son, he was her mirror, and mirrors crack when they see too much. There were attempts to edge her out. Whispers became letters. Letters became plots. Generals aligned with the boy emperor. Courtiers shifted allegiance like leaves following the sun. But Irene was not naive. She had learned the art of quiet warfare. Bribes wrapped in favors, exile masked as promotion, loyalty bought with silk and secrets. She tried to slow the tide. In public, she presented unity. In private, she tightened her circle. But Constantine, though young, had begun to speak. He resented her hold, resented the memory of a father who had mistrusted her, resented the church's devotion to her policies. In 790, he struck. Supported by a faction of the army, Constantine staged a coup. He declared himself sole emperor and placed his mother under house arrest, not in chains, not in a dungeon, but in silence. It was not a prison of stone, but of disconnection. The court no longer listened. The regents turned away. The empire, for the first time in a decade, belonged to the boy whose name she had carried like a torch through a storm. But he was not ready. Constantine's rule was marked by missteps, military failures, crushed revolts, alienated allies. He divorced his wife, married his mistress, and in doing so, ignited fury in the Orthodox Church. The boy who had dethroned his mother began to unravel, and slowly, Byzantium began to whisper again, not of rebellion, but of return. In 792, just 2 years after casting her aside, Constantine restored Irene to the court, not as regent, not as ruler, but as co-emperor. It was a title soaked in irony. She no longer ruled, but she was closer to the throne than any general. And sometimes, proximity is more dangerous than authority. She smiled beside him, attended his ceremonies, signed his decrees, and waited. The throne beside a child had taught her patience. Now, the throne beside a man would teach her something darker. Not love, not loyalty, but how to strike when the heart no longer beats like a mother's, but like a rival's. Because in Byzantium, betrayal is not born from hatred, it is born from necessity. And Irene had learned, perhaps too well, that survival does not come to those who wait. It comes to those who act when the crown begins to tremble. There is no word in any language for a mother who destroys her own child. There is widow, there is orphan, but there is no name for this, because it is not meant to exist. But in Byzantium, names are not always needed, only silence. And Irene knew how to work in silence. After being restored as co-emperor in 792, she stood once more beside her son, not behind him, not beneath him, beside. like a candle beside a dying fire, waiting for the moment it would consume the wick. Constantine VI, the boy who had dared dethrone her, had now become a man who ruled clumsily. His military campaigns failed. His popularity plummeted. His scandalous remarriage, rejecting his lawful wife and marrying his mistress, had enraged the church. He stood alone in a palace built on secrets, estranged from generals, bishops, and his own blood. Irene watched, and slowly, like a spider weaving in candlelight, she spun her web. She began to fill the court with men loyal not to the emperor, but to her, eunuchs who owed their titles to her generosity, officials who had once fallen with her and now rose again in her glow. Even the palace guards, long suspicious of Constantine, found their loyalty drifting toward the empress, who had once ruled with steady hands. By 797, the empire was divided, not between two ideologies nor two faiths, but between a mother and her son. And then came the moment. A whisper passed through the capital. Constantine was planning to exile Irene permanently. No titles, no comfort, no more pretense. He had seen the knives beneath her smiles, and so she struck first. On a humid summer morning in August 797, as the emperor prepared to leave the city for a hunting trip, Irene moved. Her agents seized the gates of the great palace. Soldiers loyal to her surrounded Constantine's chambers. There was no battle, no fanfare, just a scream, brief and muffled, then nothing. Constantine was dragged from his bed like a thief, not a son, not an emperor, just a body in the way. They took him not to execution, not to exile, but to a secret chamber. And there, under her orders, they blinded him. 2 hot irons, pressed against the eyes that had once looked at her in wonder, in trust, in confusion, now melted, now gone. It was not just punishment, it was erasure. Because in Byzantium, a blind man could not rule. What happened next is debated. Some sources claim Constantine died from the wounds. Others say he lived on, broken, locked away in a monastery, praying to a god who had gone silent. But Irene never spoke of him again. He vanished. Not just from court, but from memory. And she became the first woman in Byzantine history to rule alone as Basileus. Not empress, not regent, not mother of the emperor, but emperor in her own name. The coins changed. Her face replaced his. The inscriptions read not Augusta, but Basileus Irene, a title reserved for men, a throne meant for kings, now occupied by a woman whose hands were clean on the outside, but soaked within. But the city knew. The monks knew. Even the marble halls whispered. She blinded her son. And Irene, she did not deny it, nor did she justify it. She simply ruled. For 5 more years, she held the empire in her grip. She reasserted icon worship, reopened monasteries, strengthened the gold currency. Her court glittered with silk and incense. Foreign dignitaries bowed before her. Even Charlemagne, in the distant west, considered marrying her, uniting the fractured empires of Rome once more through a union of necessity. But beneath the surface, the rot was growing. The act of blinding Constantine had not just removed a rival, it had removed a son. And in doing so, it removed the one thing that kept her human. She had crossed a threshold no ruler, no mother, was meant to cross. And though the crown sat firm upon her head, it grew heavier by the day. In public, she stood like a pillar of marble. But in private, she aged rapidly. Her health waned, her allies thinned. Her name, once spoken with awe, was now laced with fear, because Byzantium does not forget, and it never forgives without consequence. The woman who had climbed every rung of power now stood alone at the summit. But the view was not of glory. It was of ghosts. Ghosts in every hallway. Ghosts in every mirror. Ghosts in the blind, blinking eyes of a son she no longer named. And somewhere in the depths of the palace, a room remained locked. No guards, no torches, just cold stone, and the memory of a boy who once asked, "Why does Mama sit higher than me?" That question would echo through the throne room long after the scepter slipped from her fingers. The throne had never felt so still. In the gilded chambers of the great palace, Irene sat cloaked not in silk, but in silence. The same silence that falls after a storm, when the trees still stand, but their roots rot beneath. She had ascended higher than any woman before her. She had claimed the crown as Basileus, Emperor of the Romans. And yet, something had shifted. Not outside, but within. The empire at first obeyed. Coins bore her name. Edicts carried her seal. Ambassadors addressed her with the reverence due a monarch. She walked with the authority of Caesar, signed with the will of Augustus. But power, when taken by force, seeps poison back into the hand that grabs it. Her court grew colder. The eunuchs who once whispered loyalty now whispered doubt. Bishops bowed, but their eyes lingered too long. The people, once awed, began to murmur. No woman had ever ruled alone, and no mother had ever taken a crown with her son's screams still echoing in the marble. Outside the palace walls, food prices rose. Plagues crept through the slums, and the army, once loyal, once silent, began to stir. They had followed her when she was mother to the boy king. Now she ruled alone, without divine right, without a blood heir. To them, she was an empress without a son, like a fruit tree without blossoms. And Irene, she felt it. Her health began to fray. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but like a tapestry unraveling at the corner, thread by thread. She no longer walked the gardens she once loved. The sun hurt her eyes. Her limbs ached in the night. Her appetite faded, replaced by wine and memory. The imperial physicians brought herbs, frankincense, bitter teas. But nothing cured the tremble in her fingers. She began to wear gloves, not for fashion, but to hide the way her hands no longer obeyed her. Her hair, once black as obsidian, turned the color of cold ash. Her skin paled, her spine curved, and her sleep, what little remained, was filled with visions. Sometimes she saw the boy, not as emperor, but as a child, barefoot in the palace corridors, holding out his hand and asking, "Why did you do it, Mama?" She never answered. She would wake drenched in sweat, heart racing, calling out to no one. Even the walls seemed to breathe now, as if the palace itself remembered. The gold leaf on the ceilings had dulled. The thrones groaned under her weight. The mosaics, those sacred faces she had fought to restore, seemed to avert their eyes. The empire had not turned against her. Not yet. But it had turned away. And in that turning, Irene felt something more frightening than rebellion. She felt irrelevance. A woman once at the center of divine power now found herself orbiting shadows. Decisions were delayed, petitions ignored, letters went unanswered. Even her daily audiences, once crowded with nobles and monks, grew sparse. She sat in the chrysotriklinos, waiting. Sometimes for hours, sometimes with no one to greet. They still called her emperor, but only because they hadn't chosen her replacement yet. The irony was sharp. She had blinded her son to secure the throne, and now the empire had gone blind to her presence. The poison she had poured, slow, strategic, motherly, was now dripping back down the stem of the goblet. And yet, Irene did not scream. She did not weep. She did not confess. She did what all emperors do when they feel the frost crawling under their crown. She tried to rule harder. She increased taxes. She demanded grain from the provinces. She sent envoys to secure alliances, including a possible marriage to Charlemagne, an idea that horrified the Byzantines, who saw it as trading away their sovereignty to a barbarian. Her desperation showed. It clung to her voice like rust. It crept into her posture, once regal, now defensive. She ordered new portraits of herself, standing alone, holding the orb of power, her gaze unflinching. But no amount of paint could cover the reality. Her empire no longer feared her. And in Byzantium, when fear leaves, knives enter. In 802, the final chill arrived. Not with an army, not with an assassin's blade, but with a vote. The palace guards opened the gates to a man named Nikephoros, a finance minister, a bureaucrat, a nobody in royal blood, but a somebody in timing. The Senate proclaimed him emperor. The church gave its blessing. The people did not rise. Irene was summoned, not to be executed, but to be exiled. There was no trial, no grand farewell, no public shame, just a ship, a sack of coins, and silence. They sent her to the island of Lesbos, not to die, but to disappear. The woman who had once ruled the greatest empire in the Christian world now lived in a crumbling house, weaving baskets for coins. Her hands, once gloved to hide the tremor, now worked bare in the wind. And in the evenings, when the oil ran low and the air grew cold, she would sit by the fire and stare into the embers. Not as emperor, not as mother, not even as woman, but as memory. And memory, like winter, comes for all thrones eventually. Lesbos was not a prison, but it was not a home either. It was a rock on the edge of the empire, surrounded by salt, silence, and the steady hum of waves gnawing at stone. When Irene arrived in 802, she brought little with her: a handful of servants, a chest of clothes, and the memory of a crown that no longer existed. There were no chains, no dungeon, only exile, and the kind of loneliness that wraps around your ribs and tightens one day at a time. She had once ruled Constantinople, walked barefoot across mosaic floors kissed by incense, sat beneath domes that echoed the psalms of emperors. Now she rose each morning in a crumbling villa where the walls cracked with sea wind and the oil lamps flickered like dying breath. The woman who had commanded armies, councils, and synods now commanded chickens. She was given a modest pension by Nikephoros I, the man who had replaced her. But it arrived irregularly, sometimes late, sometimes not at all. And Irene, the Empress of Byzantium, began weaving flax into cloth to survive. The chronicler Theophanes records that she lived in deep poverty and died of grief. No palace, no funeral, no mourners. just silence. And within that silence, something inside her began to split. At first, she spoke to the sea. Long, quiet monologues offered to the tide, as if Poseidon might answer where Christ no longer did. Then she began to write. Letters to the court, to the church, to the Senate. None were answered. She wrote to Charlemagne. She wrote to the patriarch. She even wrote to Nikephoros, begging not for restoration, but for forgiveness. No reply ever came. The voices in her mind grew louder than the waves. Sometimes she saw her son, Constantine, standing at the edge of her bed, his eyes not blinded, but radiant, like a saint in a mosaic. He would say nothing. Just look at her. Other times, she imagined herself back in Constantinople, walking through the halls of the Magnora, running her hand along the golden throne, turning to speak, and finding no one there. She began to fear her own reflection. There were no mirrors in the villa, but the servants reported that Irene would stare for hours into a bowl of water, as if searching for the girl from Athens who had once walked into history with steady feet. But the water did not return that image. It showed only skin gone thin as parchment, cheeks sunken, eyes clouded by something deeper than age. At night, she would light 3 candles, one for God, one for her son, and one for herself. She prayed, but not like the empress she once was, not with words shaped by theologians or chants from the Psalter. She whispered, whispers that broke mid-sentence like shattered hymns, whispers that spoke of icons, betrayals, gold coins, and red-hot irons. She repeated phrases, "I was only trying to protect him. They told me it was necessary. I never meant to be alone," as if confession could undo chronology. No one in Lesbos truly knew who she was. The locals called her the widow from the mainland. Children were warned not to speak to her. They said she had powers, could call storms, curse sheep, turn wine into seawater. But Irene did not curse. She did not cry. She simply decayed. In the fall of 803, just 1 year after her exile, she collapsed in her garden while picking herbs. A servant found her lying among thyme and rosemary, her hand grasping at the soil as if trying to dig her way back to Constantinople. A local monk was summoned. He anointed her with oil, recited prayers, and asked if she wished to confess. She said nothing. He stayed with her through the night, listening as she mumbled in half-sleep about icons, blind eyes, and a throne built from bone. By dawn, she was gone. No bells rang, no procession walked, no empire mourned. She was buried in Lesbos, in a modest grave, under olive trees that shook with the wind. No statue, no epitaph, no crown laid on the stone, only the dirt. Later, Byzantine historians would gloss over her end. Some blamed her for Constantine's downfall. Others hailed her as a restorer of orthodoxy. But few spoke of her last year, the unraveling of a mind once sharper than steel, now dulled by salt and regret. And yet, something strange happened in the years that followed. Though Nikephoros ruled, his reign was marked by chaos. He died violently in battle. His successors fell quickly through coups, illness, disaster. The throne that Irene once held seemed cursed. And slowly, whispers returned, not of her crimes, but of her strength. Monks began to reference her in prayers. Churches repainted her image alongside saints. And in the iconoclastic crisis of later generations, her name emerged again, not as a mother, not as a traitor, but as the woman who brought the icons home. The empress who had died in obscurity was now a relic, not of gold, not of marble, but of memory. And memory, when reborn, does not ask permission. It simply returns. There are deaths of the body, and then there are deaths of the name. Long after Irene's heart stopped beating in the salt-thick air of Lesbos, a quieter execution began, carried out not by sword or poison, but by ink, by omission, by silence so absolute it could strangle memory itself. It began with the coinage. Under her reign, Byzantine gold solidi bore her name, Basileus Irene, a title that defied gender and tradition. She had stood alone on currency, an emperor, not an empress, immortalized in gold. But after her fall, those coins were melted down, recast, scrubbed clean of her image. The new emperor, Nikephoros I, issued replacements, bearing his name, his face, his vision of legitimacy. Irene's visage, once struck into the hands of merchants and soldiers across 3 continents, now dissolved in furnaces. Gold does not remember. It obeys the next hand that holds it. Her decrees were next. Scrolls sealed with her emblem were quietly revoked, hidden, or edited. Edicts passed in her name were attributed retroactively to Constantine VI, or revised under the authority of Nikephoros. In the dusty libraries of Constantinople, parchment was scraped clean. Palimpsests that hid her fingerprints beneath layers of safer names. Then came the scribes, chroniclers, those fragile keepers of time, wrote carefully of her reign. Too carefully, they praised her early restoration of icons, but avoided her final years. Some omitted her entirely. Others described her downfall in single lines, devoid of emotion, like a footnote to a more proper reign. Even the church hesitated. Though Irene had convened the Second Council of Nicaea in 787 and restored veneration of icons, ending decades of religious violence, the patriarchs that followed rarely spoke of her directly. She had been useful. Now she was inconvenient. And so Byzantium, like a river flowing past a drowned body, moved on. The same empire that once bowed before her throne now stepped over her memory as if she had never existed. But the erasure was not complete. There were still fragments, splinters of truth buried beneath marble and fear. One monk, writing decades later, described her as a woman who walked among emperors with the strength of a lion and the cunning of a serpent. He did not say her name, but he did not have to. Everyone knew who he meant. Others remembered the day she had blinded her son, not with horror, but awe. Because what other woman had ever dared such a thing? Not out of hate, but out of necessity. Or so the story went. In the corners of the empire, in monasteries, on islands, among those who cherished the icons she restored, Irene was remembered, not as a saint, not as a tyrant, but as a paradox. She was both the mother and the usurper, the protector of the faith and the violator of blood. A woman who saved the soul of the empire while destroying her own. And perhaps that was the most terrifying legacy of all. Because history, especially in Byzantium, has always feared what it cannot categorize. Men who murder for power become great. Women who survive it become monsters. So Irene was buried twice, once beneath the soil of Lesbos, and again beneath centuries of deliberate forgetfulness. But her ghost lingered, not as a spirit haunting halls or whispering in crypts, but as an absence, palpable, heavy, impossible to ignore. In the imperial annals, there is a strange gap between Constantine VI and Nikephoros Fomers. A reign removed, a decade blurred. The name Irene appears only in passing, like a rumor too dangerous to speak aloud. Even her funeral rites were uncertain. Some say she received no Christian burial. Others insist she was buried with icon-covered vestments by loyal monks in secret. The truth, like her memory, was split, half sacred, half shunned. What remained of her was intangible, not bones, not relics, but contradiction. She had restored beauty and faith to Byzantium. She had ended persecution. She had ruled with a clarity many men failed to match. And yet, she had broken the sacred bond between mother and son. She had crossed a threshold that no title could justify. And the empire, shamed by her clarity and terrified by her crime, did the only thing it knew how to do. It buried her not with stone, but with silence. A silence so dense that even modern historians must dig through soot and smoke just to find her name among the ruins. But what the empire failed to understand, what every tyrant and reformer eventually forgets, is that names do not die by decree. They die only when the last voice stops speaking them. And somewhere in the shadowed aisles of monasteries, monks still carved her face into icons. Somewhere her gold solidi sit in soil, waiting to be unearthed. Somewhere her story still flickers in the half-light of memory, unextinguished. Because Irene of Athens did not vanish. She was not erased. She was buried alive, beneath history's shame, beneath patriarchy's fear, beneath the soft, deliberate murder of forgetting. And that is a death worse than death. The empire thought it was done with her. When Irene died in exile in 803, Nikephoros I sat firm on the throne she once held. A man of numbers, not vision, a bureaucrat, not a ruler born of blood. His claim to power was not divinely inspired, but forged through absence. She was gone. He was convenient. And yet, the walls of Constantinople did not breathe easier, because something had shifted, not in the court, but in the bones of the empire. The century that followed Irene's death would become one of the most unstable periods in Byzantine history, marked by revolt, assassination, and imperial blood that spilled faster than it could be crowned. Nikephoros, the man who had erased her name, was the first to fall. He died just 6 years after her exile, in 811, during the disastrous Battle of Pliska against the Bulgars. Accounts describe his death as grotesque. His head was severed, and according to the chronicler Theophanes, the skull of the Roman emperor was lined with silver and turned into a drinking cup by the Bulgar Khan, a chalice made from the mind that had erased Irene. It was more than insult. It was omen. His son, Staurakios, inherited the throne, but only for a breath. He had been wounded in the spine during the same battle and spent his entire 7-month reign paralyzed, bedridden, and tormented. Unable to walk, unable to rule, he abdicated in despair. Next came Michael the Rangabe, who tried to reverse Nikephoros' tax policies, restore church ties, and stabilize the court. But like those before him, his reign ended in humiliation. In 813, he too was defeated by the Bulgars and forced into monastic exile. According to tradition, he spent the rest of his life in a cloister, reciting psalms with a ruined voice. 3 emperors in 12 years, 3 falls, each one quieter, sadder, and shorter than the last. and behind each, a whisper. Some blamed the military, some blamed the economy. But in the back halls of Hagia Sophia, in the midnight prayers of monks, a different story emerged. That the empire was cursed, not by sorcery, but by sacrilege. One monk from the monastery of Studios wrote, "She restored the holy images, yet blinded her own son. The throne tasted her guilt, and now vomits every man who dares sit upon it." A terrible symmetry began to form. Just as Irene had ruled alone, so too would a woman return to power decades later. Zoe Carbonopsina, Theodora, and others who held influence from behind the curtain. And in each case, the men they stood beside fell, broke, or vanished. It was as if the empire itself could not forgive the precedent Irene had set, yet could not stop repeating it. Her ghost became myth. Sailors whispered that the Sea of Marmara rose higher in years after her death, washing away the foundations of coastal shrines. Farmers in Lesbos claimed their olive trees bore fruit in odd seasons near her burial site, then rotted from within. In truth, no proof of curse remains. But Byzantium never needed proof, only pattern. And the pattern was this: Irene had ruled. Irene had broken the chain of fathers and sons. Irene had touched the scepter with bare hands, not gloved in masculinity. And the empire cracked from the pressure. The church, still divided over icon veneration and imperial interference, found itself caught in a cycle of submission and rebellion. Emperors rose and fell like waves. Leo V, assassinated in church. Michael II, barely holding power. Theophilos, dying of dysentery after years of purging icon worship again. Even the very council Irene had once convened, Nicaea II, became a battleground. Its decisions questioned, its legacy politicized. What had once been holy became unstable. And yet, even in this ruin, her shadow refused to fade. In 843, 40 years after her death, Empress Theodora would finally and definitively restore icon veneration, ending the iconoclastic crisis that Irene had fought so fiercely against. On that day, celebrated ever since as the triumph of orthodoxy, Irene's name was not spoken, but her fingerprints were everywhere. Without her, there would have been no foundation, no council, no fight. She had planted the seed. Others would eat the fruit. One historian, Leo the Grammarian, writing in the 10th century, could not resist commenting, "Though she fell in disgrace, the echoes of her will built the vaults of our church. She bled truth from blasphemy, though history painted her hands with darkness." And perhaps that is the truest legacy of Irene. Not a curse in the supernatural sense, but a paradox so violent it left the empire spinning for a generation. She restored God and destroyed her son. She saved the church and shattered the throne. She ruled like an emperor and died like a beggar. And Byzantium, proud and wounded, could not hold all those truths at once. So it cracked. It turned on itself, and the throne, cold since her exile, never truly warmed again. Even now, when historians trace the fall of the Eastern Roman Empire, they point to invasions, taxes, corruption. But some still whisper, it began with a woman who sat alone and made the crown bleed. History rarely speaks with one voice. It whispers, echoes, contradicts. And when it comes to Irene of Athens, it shouts and silences in equal measure. To some, she is a murderer. To others, a saint. To most, a riddle sealed in gold and blood. The question that haunted Byzantium and still haunts the halls of scholarship today is simple in shape but bottomless in depth. Was Irene a villain or a visionary? In the years immediately following her reign, judgment came quickly and harshly. The chronicler Theophanes the Confessor, who lived during Irene's own lifetime, described her political acumen, but avoided praise. He recorded the blinding of Constantine VI in cold prose without moralizing, as if the fact was too monstrous to comment on. She seized him and blinded him with her own hands, and thus she reigned alone. No poetry, no justification, just the fact, sharp, dry, like a knife left on a table. Other early sources were less restrained. The monk Theodore the Student, an iconophile and staunch supporter of religious restoration, refused to include her in his prayers, calling her an instrument of God's justice, corrupted by ambition. Even those who agreed with her theologically flinched from her politically. The Byzantine world, ruled by divine right and patriarchal expectation, could not reconcile Irene's contradiction. She had defended the icons, yes, but at what cost? She had saved orthodoxy and sacrificed her son. That made her holy in policy, but monstrous in precedent. For centuries, this tension followed her name like a trailing veil of smoke. In the 11th century, John Skylitzes, in his Synopsis of Histories, summarized Irene's reign with a bitterness that could only come from disbelief. She was a woman with a man's heart, but not a mother's. A phrase intended as condemnation, yet unintentionally revealing. Because Irene did rule like a man. She made decisions without deferral, used exile and bribes, maneuvered in shadows. But those very traits were celebrated in emperors before and after her. Leo III, Basil I, even the great Justinian. What Irene lacked was not virtue. What she lacked was permission. Her rule was an offense not because of what she did, but because of who she was when she did it. A woman, a mother, a Greek outsider. The Byzantine elite could not stomach the image of a woman wearing the lauros, sitting on the porphyry throne, issuing laws in her own name. So they erased her when they could, or vilified her when they couldn't. And yet, judgment, like time, bends. Centuries later, Irene's memory began to shift. The Orthodox Church, after the final triumph of icon veneration in 843 under Empress Theodora, began to acknowledge Irene's role as a precursor. Without her council at Nicaea II in 787, without her early restoration efforts, the theological war might have dragged for generations. Some monks in the 10th century began to refer to her as the mother of orthodoxy. Quietly, reverently, never officially. Her image returned to icons, not as a ruler, but as a restorer, not as a mother, but as a servant of faith. The 12th century historian Zonaras went further. In his chronicles, he wrote, "She was more pious than those who came before her. She chose God above family, which may be more terrible or more righteous." That sentence, like her legacy, balanced on a knife's edge. Modern historians continue to debate her. British Byzantinist Judith Heron describes Irene as the most powerful woman in Byzantine history, and perhaps the most misunderstood. She notes that Irene ruled during a time of intense instability, religious civil war, and succession crises, and yet kept the empire intact, maintained administrative continuity, and stabilized the currency. Historian Warren Treadgold, more critical, argues that her rule marked the end of traditional succession and the beginning of chaos, suggesting that her usurpation of her son violated the sacred continuity of emperors and damaged the legitimacy of the throne. Yet others point to her restoration of the icons as her most enduring legacy. The Nicaea II Council, convened under her regency, formally ended iconoclasm, at least temporarily, re-established harmony with the Western Church, and reaffirmed the authority of sacred image in Orthodox theology. Her role in that council was not ceremonial. She orchestrated it, funded it, chose the bishops, presided over the proceedings. Even Charlemagne, watching from the west, acknowledged her as ruler of the East and considered marrying her to unify the fractured Roman Empire. What other woman could command such awe, such diplomacy, such fear? And yet, her name was missing from the diptychs. Her feast day was never proclaimed. No church was built in her honor. She was never canonized. Because Byzantium, though it sometimes forgave bloodshed, never forgave precedent. Irene had proven that a woman could rule alone, that a mother could wield an iron scepter, that power could wear a veil and still break an empire's spine. And so the empire judged her, not by her policies, her victories, or her beliefs, but by the thing it feared most, her possibility. She was not the first to reach for power. She was simply the first who dared to close her hand around it. And when she did, the world blinked, then turned away. If memory were stone, Irene would still stand. But memory is softer than that. It cracks, it fades, and sometimes it disappears entirely. Today, we search for Irene not in palaces, but in fragments. A coin, a line of text, a faded fresco in a forgotten chapel. She ruled an empire for more than 2 decades. Yet the world left her no tomb, no statue, no cathedral that bears her name. It is perhaps the cruelest irony. The first woman to rule the Byzantine Empire alone was buried in silence. And that silence still echoes. During her reign as Basileus, Irene minted gold solidi bearing her image and title. Irene Vasileus, Irene the Emperor. These coins were radical. Not only did they display her alone, without her son or husband, but they used the masculine form Basileus, not Basilissa, Empress. One such coin, discovered near Antioch and now housed in the British Museum, shows Irene enthroned, wearing the lauros and holding the globus cruciger, symbols of absolute imperial authority. It was more than currency. It was a declaration that the empire bowed not to a man, but to her. But after her deposition in 802, these coins were systematically withdrawn. Nikephoros, I ordered new mints. Old coins were recast, melted, their gold reshaped into new imperial likenesses. The very metal that once bore her face was pressed flat, turned anonymous. As the 10th century chronicler Leo the Deacon noted, the empress's image was removed from the hand of the people and her name from their tongues. Yet some coins survived, hidden, buried, forgotten. And in their glint, we see what history tried to erase. No official portrait of Irene survives. No fresco in Hagia Sophia. No mosaic in the imperial chapel. But in monasteries once loyal to her cause, particularly those in Greece and Asia Minor, there are whispered stories of icons that once bore her image beside Christ, Pantocrator, or the Virgin Mary. Some say these were devotional pieces, painted in gratitude after her restoration of icon veneration in 787. Others say they were political, a way to remind the faithful who defended their saints when emperors burned them. None are confirmed. But one icon, preserved in Mount Athos before being smuggled to Italy during the Ottoman advance, shows a crowned female figure in imperial dress, kneeling before the Virgin. A Greek inscription beneath it reads, "She who returned the eyes of the faithful." No name, no date. But the robe is unmistakable, the posture defiant. Some call it Irene, others call it blasphemy. In Byzantine tradition, only saints and emperors were painted into iconography. To depict a woman who had blinded her son among the holy was both sacred and scandalous. Yet she's there, if not in name, then in outline. No monument marks Irene's final resting place. According to most sources, she died on the island of Lesbos in 803, living in poverty, buried without imperial rites. No tomb inscription survives, no sarcophagus, no royal chapel. Some traditions suggest that her body was taken by monks and secretly interred in a monastery near Mytilene, where pilgrims once lit candles in her name. Others claim she was buried in unmarked ground as a symbol of disgrace. The truth is likely this: she was buried as she died, nameless. In Byzantium, imperial burials were political theater. Tombs were designed to preserve not just the body, but the legacy. Hagia Sophia, the Church of the Holy Apostles, the imperial mausolea, all housed emperors beneath vaults of gold and stone. But Irene's bones lie elsewhere, beneath olive roots, or within monastery soil, or perhaps scattered to dust, indistinguishable from any peasant. The 13th century historian George Acropolites, reflecting on Irene's erasure, wrote, "She vanished not in body, but in inscription. Her name withered where others grew. There are no surviving buildings attributed to Irene, no churches bearing her monogram, no palace wings that carry her initials. This, too, is telling. Her predecessors, Leo III, Constantine V, left behind foundations. Basil I would later build the Nea Ecclesia. But Irene's legacy was not in brick or marble. It was in policy, in doctrine, in a council she convened, and a theology she defended. The Second Council of Nicaea in 787, her greatest act, left no physical trace, no chapel, no monument. And yet, in Orthodox tradition, its decisions stand as one of the 7 ecumenical councils, the pillars of Christian doctrine. She may not be painted on cathedral ceilings, but her fingerprints remain in every icon, kissed by candlelight. Perhaps the most haunting image of Irene is the one Byzantium never intended: the empty space, the missing face on the fresco, the melted coin, the blank inscription. By denying her a portrait, history created one. A negative space so sharp it cuts. She is remembered not for what was preserved, but for what was destroyed. Not for what she built, but for what could not be buried. And so, Irene's last portrait is not of flesh, nor pigment, nor stone. It is the shape she left behind in history's fabric. A silence that still whispers in gold, in dust, in firelight. She was not meant to be seen, but she remains impossible to unsee. She died without a crown, without a tomb, without a name that echoed in the halls she once ruled. But the silence left behind by Irene of Athens speaks louder than any anthem. She was not the first to grasp for power. She was simply the first woman to take it in both hands, wrap it around her own name, and refuse to let go, even when it burned. In a world where power was inherited through blood and guarded by men who claimed divine favor, Irene did the unthinkable. She did not wait. She did not marry to gain legitimacy. She did not rule behind a curtain. She took the throne and paid the price. A woman in armor, a mother with a sword behind her back, a believer who saved the church while damning her own bloodline. Byzantium could not forgive her, and so it tried to forget her. But memory is stubborn. Each time an icon is kissed in an Orthodox chapel, her shadow passes behind the gold. Each time a historian opens the scrolls of the 8th century, her name lingers, half erased, never gone. The empire buried her with no epitaph, but what she did became one. And as time pulls us further from her century, we are left not with certainty, but with a question. What happens to those who rule before the world is ready for them? They are punished. Not always in life, but always in the way they are remembered. They are broken into myths, half witch, half martyr. They are reduced to symbols, too sharp for comfort, too real to ignore. Maybe Irene was never meant to be understood. Maybe she was meant to haunt, to linger in the corners of empire, not as a warning, but as a mirror, to show us what power looks like when it wears the wrong face and speaks with the wrong voice. She wasn't evil, nor innocent. She was human, just too human in a world that demanded masks. We call her the mother who blinded her son, but perhaps history should also call her what she was, the last to believe that a crown could be worth the cost if it meant changing the world. There will never be another Irene, not because her path is impossible, but because it is unforgettable. She stood alone on the throne of a world that wasn't made for her. And though the world pushed her into the sea, the ripples of her footsteps still reach the shore. She ruled in the wrong century, died on the wrong island, wore the right crown on the wrong head, and in doing so, became unforgettable.